I'm Catherine Mazzone here on behalf of MojoStreaming, and I'm very honored to introduce our guest today, Stephanie Boyles Griffin. She's with the Botstiber Institute for Wildlife Fertility Control. Thank you so much for being with us,
Thank
Stephanie.
you for having me, Catherine.
Absolutely. I want to get a little background first on the Botstiber Institute, just because it might be unfamiliar to some people.
Mhm. The institute was launched in 2016, and it was meant to sort of address this growing, emerging field of of management, and it's wildlife fertility control, and that exists in a space that some people refer to as human-wildlife conflicts. So this is an alternative approach to traditional lethal methods that have been used in the past to mitigate conflicts between humans and wildlife. And it sort of was spawned by this growing desire globally. There are a lot of public attitudes, values that are shifting away from sort of traditional views of wildlife towards a thought process that's often referred to as mutualism. So coexistence, basically, coexisting with the natural world, seeing animals that share our spaces as neighbors and parts of our community, rather than animals that are for us to use for some reason. And for that reason, the people have been looking for alternative ways to manage wildlife populations and address conflicts that exist. And that's why the Institute exists. There's a lot of public expectations about this field of wildlife management. It's still relatively new. And that's why we exist, is simply to educate policymakers, wildlife managers, and the public about the role that fertility control can play in mitigating these human wildlife conflicts, and then promoting coexistence. And we do that three ways. We do it by holding events like the event we just had in Colorado Springs. It was the 9th International Conference on Wildlife Fertility Control. We get scientists, policymakers, wildlife managers, and the public from all over the world to get together and talk about what has progressed since the last conference. So that's just an example. And then we also have a very robust public education program, just making people aware of why anybody would want to use a form of wildlife fertility control to resolve conflicts with animals, and what that means. And then a grants program that we use to try and advance the field by supporting both research and public education projects. Our goal is sort of to be a clearinghouse for the entire field. So everyone that's out there doing amazing work and trying to figure out where it's appropriate and necessary to use an alternative form of wildlife management, and then actually working out the logistics of creating agents and methods that will work, that are safe, humane, and effective and sustainable, and then figuring out how to implement those in real world situations. So our goal is to keep that community together and talking to one another, and then be a resource for policy managers and the public to learn more about the field. There's a lot of public expectations associated with this field. People want non-lethal methods in a lot of cases, and they want to use fertility control, but sometimes it's not appropriate. And what I mean by that is, in a lot of cases, most human wildlife conflicts can be resolved without the need for population management at all. Most conflicts are site specific, and therefore the solution is site specific. It doesn't involve population reduction at all, whether you're talking about lethal, non-lethal, or a combination of the two things. And so it's just as important as an institute that we be explaining to people what fertility control is not intended to do, and where it's not appropriate, as it is where it might be, and where practical applications either exist or could exist with additional research and education.
So when you say fertility control, the first thing that pops in my head is somehow controlling, mating and the actual personal relations of these animals.
Yeah.
And of course, that's not it, because I've talked to a number of people just since I've been with Mojo who are implementing a lot of these non-lethal strategies. But again, like you said, some of them are site specific. So frankly, I don't know which ones are fertility control and which ones were just site specific mitigation.
So site-specific mitigation, an example of that would be trying to keep a population of animals, let's just say, urban deer, out of a ecologically sensitive area. The best site-specific mitigation tool generally would be fencing, strategic fencing to keep the animals out, right? So when we talk about site-specific, that's what we're talking about. Maybe we're talking about treating some sort of vegetation that they don't want the animals to browse on with a repellent of some kind, or maybe both. So that's the simplest example that I can use of having a site-specific problem and using a site-specific mitigation measure to resolve the problem. And whereas, attempting to use population control to do that, that would be difficult, because even though the population would be lower, if that area is attractive and accessible to the animals that you're concerned with going in and doing having some sort of impact on it, that's not going to keep the animals that exist from going in there, right? So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about something that's not necessarily density dependent, that it's really a site-specific issue, and therefore attempting to use a population management tool to address it might not be the best approach. It's not to say that it wouldn't have any impact, but it may not be the best approach. Some of the most obvious ideas of what birth control looks like just from human experience or experience that we have with cats and dogs is surgical. So either doing an ovariectomy or a spay on a cat or a dog, or doing a vasectomy or a neuter on a cat or a dog, right? And even though that can be extremely effective in that once you surgically sterilize an animal, you never have to touch them again. It's invasive. Some methods are less invasive than others, depending on species and context. But the less that we have to handle an animal, the better from a welfare standpoint. And it's not as efficient either, if you're talking about the amount of labor and time and costs associated with it. So there are a number of wildlife fertility control agents. One category of them are immunocontraceptives that are probably the most well-known. They've been studied the most. And what they do is they prompt the immune system to do something to interfere with the reproductive process of an individual animal. And so there are fertility control vaccines that are well known. For instance, probably the most well known of the two are porcine zona pellucida, or PZP, and a product called Gonacon. And they work differently, but they basically do the same thing. They're both immunocontraceptives, and they both do something to block fertilization in some way. But both of them are injectable. So these are not oral contraceptives. These are contraceptives that have to be injected. They can be injected either a hand injection, or they can be injected using a dart projector and a dart.
So these are not like human. These are not the same things that women take for contraceptive.
No, it's different. This is an immunocontraceptive. And then you have other products that are available, actually already registered with the EPA. Those two products are registered with the EPA under the brand name Zonistat H or Zonistat D for PZP, and then Gonacon Equine for Gonacon. But then there are also oral contraceptives that are on the market and are being used now for animals like pigeons. There's a product that's called Ova Control that's produced by a company called Analytics out of San Diego. And then there is an oral contraceptive for commensal rodents, so rats, that's called Contrapest, and it's made by a company called Sinestec out of Flagstaff, Arizona. There are practical applications. These are products that have been registered for use by the Environmental Protection Agency, and also on the state level for use in certain species and context. But this is still an emerging field. There's a lot of work that still needs to be done. And that's the role that the Institute intends to play, is teaching people about what exists now, what might be coming up in the future, and getting practitioners together to talk about it.
Is this already being, I know you said it's already being applied, but here in the United States was one area you mentioned.
There's a desire to try to find other ways to mitigate conflicts between humans and wildlife. Mm-hmm. And those conflicts are, at the same time, while people want alternatives to traditional approaches, at the same time, these conflicts are growing because our populations are growing. We're encroaching on more and more wildlife habitat. Wildlife is attempting where they can to adapt to these changes that we're creating on the landscape. In a lot of cases, they are successfully adapting, but when they do, good on them, but when they do, it can create conflicts. So you've got growing conflicts, but then you've got wildlife managers that are being asked to mitigate these conflicts and manage them, with the public, also a growing proportion of the public saying, yes, but we want you to mitigate these conflicts, but we do not want you to use lethal methods to do it. And so they're constrained. They're having options that have typically been available to them getting taken away, but it also creates opportunity for innovation. And so that's what's happening, is that the public is saying, we want you to mitigate conflicts. We don't want you to use lethal methods unless it's absolute last resort. And if you do that, we want it done in the most humane way possible. And it has to be completely justified. You can't just do it because it's expeditious. You only if it's absolutely necessary. And oh, by the way, if there's a way of managing them that doesn't involve having to kill them, that's definitely preferable for us. Not everywhere, but that's where we come in. We don't come in as a replacement necessarily for lethal methods. It's trying to find that balance to create a win-win for wildlife and the people that are attempting to coexist with them in a place where lethal methods may not be acceptable, feasible, effective, or even legal. So those are some of the reasons why having this as a potential population management tool it may be preferable in those situations where there aren't a lot of other options out there. But also when it's being used as part of an integrated approach, a holistic approach, right, to managing conflict between humans and wildlife. In a lot of cases, it's not that these animals are exceeding some sort of biological carrying capacity. It's that they've exceeded a social carrying capacity, and that's completely subjective. It's going to change from place to place, which is what makes trying to mitigate for these conflicts very challenging. We can't come up with the one size fits all for any of this. And that's why we ask people first not to jump in and assume that this is a solution to a quote unquote problem with an animal. It's really important on the front end to do the really hard work of figuring out what the impacts are and how the community feels about it, and what their acceptance level is for various ways of addressing it, both site specific and, if necessary, some sort of population management to decrease those impacts or address those impacts to some sort of acceptable level. And that level of acceptability is going to be different from place to place too. So it's complicated.
That is very tough. That's incredibly difficult. And that leads me to wonder, what kind of feedback have you received? I'm sure it's been very mixed, right, across the board.
I don't want to say that the Institute has received feedback. When you read some of the public surveys that come out about how the general population feels about their relationship with wildlife, and therefore how they would feel about fertility control, it's really a mixed bag, and it all depends on the species and context. The acceptability level of impacts is going to change depending on what animal we're talking about and what part of the United States. Those values and attitudes change from state to state, from within a state, from community to community. And that's why these all have to be community based, all of them. because again, there's just not a one size fits all that is going to address issues from one community to another. But there are a lot of really great people that have been working in this human wildlife conflict space for a while that are aware of this and are really good at working with communities to shepherd them through the process of making these really difficult decisions on how to address situations like this, so that they're getting the best outcome for the animals possible, but also getting a good outcome for the community as well. And sometimes maybe fertility control might be part of that, but that's part of our job, is to sort of educate people about, what the limitations are, and that it's not always the most appropriate approach to pursue. Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like a big part of your role is, like you said, the education part, and that is, would you say that that's kind of evolving over time as this evolves? I mean,
Yeah,
for
no,
lack of a better word.
that's really, really good point. What I would say is, when this first came up as a possibility, when people like, well, what if we did this instead? There were so many people in the science world that were so anxious to see if it's something that we could do, that I don't think, what took a back seat is figuring out, number one, where it's actually appropriate, whether we should be doing it, and if so, when, and how to evaluate stakeholder groups within a community to figure out whether that this is something that they're actually interested in doing. Because it's easy to get excited about something like this. All of these projects, these human wildlife conflict mitigation projects, take a lot of work. And the most important part we found out through trial and error are these stakeholder engagement efforts that are on the front end when you've just identified that you might have a problem with a population of animals in your community. It's very easy for people to jump to alternative methods of population management, as I said, as a solution. But the better approach is to really dig deep into what the impacts are that the population is having that's a concern to the community, and then work backwards from that on what the appropriate response should be. So like I said, it's going to be different for everybody. Yeah. And maybe at the end of that process, fertility control is an option that they want to pursue, but that's really the best way to go about getting from there to, do we want to consider fertility control? Sometimes we start with fertility control and work our way back, and we've learned, like I said, through trial and error, that's probably not the best way to go about doing it.
What, it sounds like you face a lot of challenges just because this subject matter is so complicated, and because it's niche in the sense that it's not the right fit for everyone. So how do you deal with that? How do you deal with that challenge and explain that to people, not only policy wise, but also people on the ground?
I think it's really important to just have an open dialogue with the stakeholders involved, and understand that there are going to be a lot of different perspectives on this. It's new, it's innovative, it's been around for a while, but it's just now, I think, we're starting to actually see it being used in practical ways to manage conflicts. And I think it's going to continue to grow as new agents become available, and they're better than their predecessors. You're going to see more options for applying it, and you're going to see this happening more and more. But with that, again, there's going to be a learning curve associated with all of these things. And that's what we're trying to help manage as the Institute. And by bringing everyone together, having them share experiences with one another, so people aren't having to start from ground zero. They can, and they can avoid making some of the same errors or mistakes in attempting to get these projects off the ground, by knowing a little bit from people that have been working in this field, in some cases for almost 3 decades, learning from the very, very beginning some of the things you want to keep in mind that they wish they had done on some of their first projects that they now incorporate into walking into new projects. Yeah.
So as this becomes more prevalent and more practically applied, how do you see your role or the Institute's role changing over the next decade or so, however long it takes for this thing to really pick up?
Well, I think generally we're hoping to continue to acquire partners that will help us expand and build capacity and learn how we have done what we've been doing for now 6 years. And that will be a way of expanding our reach without actually having to create greater capacity, because
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that what we're doing is unique. It's simply unique to our field. You know, there are groups like the Alliance for Contraception in Cats and Dogs that fill a very similar role that the Botstiber Institute does for the field of wildlife fertility control. They do it for non-surgical sterilization of cats and dogs. You know, that's their goal, is to be sort of that clearinghouse for everyone working to try and develop non-surgical sterilization and contraception in cats and dogs, male and female. And so they're very targeted on cats and dogs, whereas our field, all kinds of different species and contexts, but we both serve similar roles in being sort of a catalyst and a clearinghouse for everyone that's working in that field. And so that's the role we play, is just kind of tying everyone together and then welcoming a lot of other people that may be new to it, for them to have a place to start to become familiar with the entire field. Because some people are just working on one species and context. And I'm certain that because we exist, they're able to contact us, they're able to go to our website, they're able to find people that are working in other species and contexts, and there's crossover there. And that's what accelerates progress. And so I think ultimately that's how I think we would define as success. Without us, that's what a catalyst is, right? It's something that exists that speeds up a process that otherwise may have occurred, but may not have occurred as fast. That's what we really are trying to serve as a catalyst for the field.
Awesome. And so just to be clear, this is a partnership with the Humane Society. It's kind of an offshoot, so to speak.
Botstiber Institute, it really is a sort of a working partnership between the HSUS and the Botstiber Foundation. It's housed at the Botstiber Foundation, which is located in Media, Pennsylvania. My colleague Monique Principe serves as the managing director, and then we have a staff that works with us to run the institute. And then I serve as the science and policy director, and my role at the HSUS is the senior scientist in the Wildlife Protection Department. So and part of my responsibilities as a senior scientist at the HSUS is to work as the science and policy director with the Botstiber Institute for Wildlife Fertility Control. So.
And you were with HSUS for over a decade before, or about a decade before this even started.
I've been with them for 15 years, and we started the Institute 6 years ago. So I'd already been with the HSUS for 10 years before. So
I want to hear what sparked your interest. What really was
in the Institute?
Yeah, what was the catalyst for the Institute?
Okay, so I had been working in the field of again, human wildlife conflict mitigation for it's 25 years now. So before the Institute, it would have been almost 20. And while I was at HSUS, I worked on two, and this was the only two things I worked on, but I worked on two things that involved fertility control. One was I was the policy lead on wild horse and burro management in the United States. And then I was working also with teams at the HSUS that were doing pilot projects and research projects on the use of fertility control for wild equids and urban deer in the United States. So I was doing all of that at the time when the foundation, the administrator of the foundation actually read an article about our deer contraception work, I believe, in our All Animals magazine back in, I think, 2012, 2013. He and I started corresponding on that. And long story short, within a few years of us working together and talking about this and getting an understanding of where this field was. I think it was him that said, what would really be cool is if there was an institute devoted to being sort of a clearinghouse of information on this entire field, and that seems to be missing. The field had been holding the International Conference for Wildlife Fertility Control every 4 or 5 years since 1989, when the first one was held in Philadelphia, just outside of Philadelphia. And so that was the first. And so the last one I attended and helped organize was the 7th, and that was in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. So the first thing I said was, well, one thing an institute could do is this conference series that's been going on since the late 80s doesn't have a permanent home. And I think the field keeps taking turns organizing it. Somebody just basically puts their hands up and says, yeah, I'll do it this time. And then they spend 3 or 4 years organizing it. And I said, I think it would be a tremendous service to the field for somebody to just own this and then work with people that are leaders in the field to help organize it every 4 or 5 years. So that would be a great start. And so that was our flagship event. We hosted the 8th International Conference on Wildlife Fertility Control in Washington, D.C. in July of 2017. And then since then, if you check out our website, you can see what we've been doing since then. It's all on there. If anybody wants to know, what have you been doing for 6 years? It's there. Check out our website. We got a ton of content on there. So thanks to my colleague, Rose Lombardo, and the rest of our staff. It's huge what we've done, the amount of information that's on there from all these incredible people all over the world that are doing amazing work in this field. It's tremendous. And then just this past year, we had the 9th International Conference on Wildlife Fertility Control in Colorado Springs, and it was very well attended. I think one of the best ones I've been to. It was just so well attended and supported by so many different stakeholders and players in this field. So yeah, that's how it started. I mean, that really is in a nutshell how I got involved. So complete. I don't want to say it was an accident, but I think Terry Klein, who is the administrator of the Botstiber Foundation, is a very progressive forward thinker. He saw a need and has been having the foundation support it for all this time now. So I think it's great. I think what makes me passionate about it personally is that, my goal for 25 years was to be sort of a mediator between wildlife and the public, and to try to find ways for us to all coexist together. And this space wasn't being occupied by somebody, and clearly there was a need for it. And I put my hand up, that was basically it. I knew that this had the potential to help people and wildlife coexist in a mutually beneficial way. And I wanted to play whatever part I could in that. And there were certainly other things I could have done. And some days I wish I had, because it's really challenging.
A lot.
It is not easy. This is not easy work. And I share that with all of my colleagues and peers that work in this space. And I don't mean just the wildlife fertility control space. I'm talking about the human wildlife conflict and coexistence space. But I, whereas I was one of few people that was working in it 25 years ago, now it is huge. It's a huge space, and it's not because of me, and it's not honestly because of my peers and colleagues. We're just a reflection of values and attitudes that are shifting away from the sort of utilitarian attitude we've had towards animals and wildlife included all these years, to one of mutualism. So I'm just a product of that, and I realize that. And so is everyone else, I'm sure, that works in the space. And it's the reason why the space is growing. So while me and a lot of my colleagues might like to take credit for it, that we've changed hearts and minds, I think we've done a little bit of that, but I think hearts and minds have been changing on their own too. And so it's really a pleasure and privilege to be working in this space at this point in time. Yeah.
That's powerful.
as I noted earlier, a lot of the conflicts that exist between humans and wildlife were created by us. And if we can create the problems, we can solve them. You know, we've put men on the moon. We can do this. I always, whenever I think that this is overwhelming and it's just too challenging, I always remind myself of that. There are a lot of smart people out there, and we put men on the moon. We can solve conflicts with humans and wildlife in a humane, effective, and sustainable way. And we're starting to get better at it.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. It's awesome to watch.
Yeah.
What else haven't I asked you, Stephanie, that you think is important for people to know?
I think just generally being kind to our wild neighbors, and then kind to each other in that space. There are a lot of people that have a lot of different perspectives about resolving conflicts between humans and wildlife. I often tell people that I don't really resolve conflicts between humans and wildlife. I don't do it. A lot of my colleagues and peers don't. What we're trying to do is resolve conflicts between humans about wildlife. Mm-hmm. Right? Because it's that creates the conflict. Yeah, the animal may be doing something that within a community a lot of people take exceptions to. But I was a trained wildlife biologist. I spend a lot more of my time with people than I actually do wildlife in my chosen profession. That's not what I expected. And I spend time trying to help people get along with each other and come to mutually beneficial solutions that ultimately create the best outcomes for wildlife. So it is sort of not exactly human wildlife conflict. It's human to human conflict about managing wildlife.
It's an important thing to note. I mean, because you're absolutely right. It's not like we're in an argument with a herd of elephants about something. We're in an argument about
2 or 3 or 4, 5, 6, 7 different stakeholder groups about how to manage wild horses in the Western U.S. on public lands that are a multi-mandate, lands that are multiple use by law. So you've got all of these stakeholders that all have different opinions on how those animals should be managed. So it really is us attempting to manage all of those desires and wants and needs, and trying to get the best outcome for the animals all of the animals that exist on public lands, including our wild horses and burros, for instance. So yeah. That was probably a longer answer than you wanted.
No, it was the right answer.
That is the thing about my job and about the field of wildlife fertility control and human wildlife coexistence, that I think people, if they thought about it for a little while, they would come to the same realization about that, is that we really are trying to solve conflicts between humans about wildlife.
Mm-hmm. No, it's very true. Thank you so much for your time, Stephanie. I really appreciate it.